The hearing will come to order, and welcome to all of you. Today's hearing has been a long time in the making. For some 37 years since the birth of modern Zimbabwe, Robert Mugabe has dominated the political landscape of this resource-rich and promising country, first as prime minister, then as president, and always as strongman. It was a 37 rule which sadly betrayed the post-colonial aspirations of freedom, one of which was marked by misrule, mismanagement, and mistreatment of Mugabe's fellow citizens. For many Zimbabweans, and for many years, envisioning a Zimbabwe without Mugabe was considered a fool's errand. Elections, some more flawed than others, had come and gone, opportunities for reform fallen by the wayside, and through it all, the domineering presence of one man haunted the dreams of his countrymen. Then, in a matter of weeks, culminating last November, the landscape changed. The once invincible ruler in October of 2017 set into motion a series of events which left him not only ousted from the Zimbabwean National Union Patriotic Front, or ZANU-PF, but pushed off his presidential perch. The drama began in earnest when Mugabe sought to prop up his wife Grace's standing as his designated successor by ousting one of his two vice presidents, Emmerson Mnangagwa, presumably to elevate his wife to the position, while simultaneously moving against Mnangagwa's allies in the government and in ZANU-PF, promoting a younger generation allied with Grace. Mnangagwa was part of an older faction of ZANU-PF, the generation that fought for liberation with roots and strong connections in the military. As Rhodesian Bush War veterans and political survivors, Mnangagwa and his comrades could draw upon a reservoir of experience and cunning. They were not to be so easily pushed aside. So while Mugabe sought to tighten the reins of control in favor of his wife and her allies, the other vice president and head of the Zimbabwe Defense Force, Constantino Chiwenga, made a bold statement on November 13, saying, and I quote, "Matters of protecting our revolution, the military will not hesitate to step in." This was declared treasonous, but before Chiwenga himself could be arrested, the Zimbabwe Defense Forces did, in fact, step in and confine the long-serving president to his quarters while taking control of key points around the country. What followed were spontaneous popular demonstrations against Robert Mugabe, indicating that the spell had been broken. ZANU-PF convened a meeting which declared Mnangagwa to be interim leader of the party, and in the face of impeachment proceedings against Mugabe, the 93-year-old president reluctantly stepped down, allowing Mnangagwa to assume the vacancy. This series of actions preserved the veneer of constitutional process, such that neither our country nor the African Union could label the events that took place a coup. Indeed, if it were a coup, it was popularly supported one, and one which subsequently received high court ratification. So where does that leave us? Who is Emmerson Mnangagwa, the man who was sworn in as Zimbabwe's president on November 21st? Critics have called him the crocodile and recall his role as Mugabe's right-hand man and confidant, including during the brutal period in the early 1980s, when in the newly independent nation, Mugabe waged an internal campaign of repression against fellow revolutionary leader Joshua Nkomo, killing thousands of ethnic minority individuals who were followers of Nkomo. During this time, Mugabe was assisted by military advisors from East Germany and North Korea, and his Minister of State Security, Emmerson Mnangagwa. Others more charitably admit that Mnangagwa was indeed once the crocodile, but maintain that he has changed, undergoing a religious conversion to evangelical Christianity. Indeed, his rhetoric since acceding to power has been reassuring, stating that he will restore democracy, rule of law, economic prosperity, and trade while addressing endemic corruption. On the issue of land tenure, he said he would end the seizures of property that Mugabe had used to punish enemies and to reward cronies. So they stand at a crossroads, perhaps facing a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity where Zimbabwe can chart a new course. Yet we cannot forget and cannot be Pollyannish about it, nor disregard the wise words of Pete Townsend, who once said, "Meet the new boss, same as the old boss, we won't get fooled again." Hopefully none of that will be true. On the issue of land seizures, for example, one notes that the newly retired general, as of December 28, 2017, the new Vice President Constantino Chiwenga, who issued the treasonous challenge that led to Mugabe's ouster, is alleged to be a beneficiary of Mugabe's past largesse with other people's land. This is perhaps something which one of our witnesses today could, or all of them, might want to speak to and clarify. Indeed, as we attempt to read the tea leaves and discern what is in the future, we will be assisted by a stellar panel. While the State Department is unable to send a witness due to the immediacy of issues concerning the budget and Secretary of State Tillerson's impending trip to Africa, we have with us a former ambassador to the United States, a very distinguished one at that, to Zimbabwe, as well as one of the key implementers of our democracy promotion policy in Zimbabwe. We also have two Zimbabweans with us who are extremely well-versed, and involved in the contemporary events in the country. Today's hearing will look at the prospects for true democratic and governance reform, as well as the potential restoration of the rule of law. We truly hope that the arrival of a new government signals an opportunity for establishing a mutually beneficial relationship between the United States and Zimbabwe, and that as the near future unfolds, events will allow us to reevaluate some of the sanctions that were imposed during the Mugabe years. I'd like to yield to my good friend and ranking member, Ms. Bass, for any opening comments. Oh, okay. I'll go to the chairman of the full committee.
I thank you. Karen, thanks for, Congresswoman, thanks for allowing me to make an opening statement as well. And let me thank the both of you for your engagement on the continent, an engagement that has been consistent, and now there are some new opportunities. I recall it's about 20 years ago that I was in Harare and in Baholeo, and the emotional feeling of listening to Morgan Tsvangirai supporters, and later him, speak about that issue of human rights, and going back later and not being able to get into the country, but having the opportunity to meet with some of those who had been tortured or had gone through a lot, and not just members of that movement for democratic change, also some of the ZANU-PF members that I talked to who tried to speak out. And this is the problem of a society in which you have a totalitarian aspect that takes hold. And slowly economic freedom erodes, opportunity erodes, and you have a situation where people have absolutely no ability any longer to choose their leaders or to choose the future for their country. Now that is in play again. Now there is that opportunity. And I know the international community and NGOs and those concerned with leading on human rights have great hope at this point in time. We watched here on this committee as the regime stripped away the opportunity that existed for people. But Zimbabwe, as you all know, was once the breadbasket for the region. And we had a Zimbabwe Democracy and Economic Recovery Act that we passed here in 2001, in which we tried to shape events there. But today, we've got to be clear-headed, I think, as we look at the prospects for democracy. Some members of the current government did have a role in the oppressive and violent policies that characterized the Mugabe regime. Some are responsible for some of the worst abuses. But on the other hand, we do have that opportunity. And we have a lot of people in Zimbabwe today who have second thoughts and are looking back at what happened and how it happened. And I think a lot of those individuals are really determined to make certain that Zimbabwe now has that chance to chart its future. We remember Morgan Tsvangirai, recently deceased, of course, but we remember him for his unwavering struggle. And I think the July elections, they're quickly approaching. This will be an important test. I think the people of Zimbabwe, At this point, it's their time. It's their opportunity. But elections have got to be credible. They've got to be peaceful. They must be transparent. I think the government must take steps to combat corruption, to protect freedom of expression, to end state-backed violence and intimidation, and address other issues in terms of the rights of the people. The U.S., I think, should see meaningful progress towards these reforms before we revise our current policy, because we need a little leverage in this. And I think the U.S. would be a partner in all of these reform efforts. I think we will have bipartisan support for that partnership. And I think it's through these reforms that we will see again prosperity and opportunity. I'm not sure I should say see again. I think maybe see for the first time, because Zimbabwe had a long, struggled, tortured history. But finally, that chapter is over. And like the previous chapters in that history, it has been tough on the people of Zimbabwe. So let's all of us do what we can do. But I appreciate these witnesses traveling so far to testify. I've got a meeting with an ambassador here adjacent, but I want to again thank you, Chris, Chairman, and thank you very much, Congresswoman, for your engagement here.
Thank you very much, Chairman Royce. Thank you for taking the time out of what I know is an extremely busy schedule to be here. Your commitment and concern about Africa is legendary, so thank you for being here. Thank you. I'd like to now yield to Karen Bass, again, the ranking member, for any opening comments you might have.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and ditto to the words that you just said about our chairman and his long history of support for Africa. In November 2017, we all know that Robert Mugabe's 30-year presidency ended. The circumstances under which he left office included a military operation, preliminary proceedings to impeach him, and most importantly, ordinary citizens dancing, cheering, and waving flags in the streets. Why would Zimbabweans march alongside the military, celebrating and demanding the resignation of Mugabe? Well, there are a host of reasons. The answer is pretty simple. As our witness, Dr. Dendere, will point out, for the first time, Zimbabweans felt a sense of hope for their political and economic future. There are many ways to read this current moment, and today we will attempt to consider how the U.S. can best re-engage the government of Zimbabwe. It will be tempting to tie everything to the next elections, to focus on allowing international observers, ensuring free, fair, and transparent elections to make sure that elections take place this year. And although we know this is important, normalizing relations with Zimbabwe requires more than a good election. First, we have to consider that while this is not exactly a traditional military coup, it also wasn't a regular democratic transition of power. The military has a long history of partisanship with the ruling party, interfering in the nation's political and electoral affairs in ways that adversely affected the ability of citizens to vote freely. The partisanship of the security forces' leadership has translated into abuses by these forces against civil society, activists, journalists, and members and supporters of the opposition political party, the Movement for Democratic Change. The military played a key role in this transition, and while some citizens expressed support for the transition of power, recent polling by the Afrobarometer shows that 69% of Zimbabweans are against military rule and 75% prefer democracy over any other form of government. This should give the Mnangagwa government a sense of what their citizens want. Going forward, it will be important for the military to show that they will comply with the Constitution by staying out of the electoral process. The military should have no role in the upcoming political campaigns. And I don't say this lightly. Everyone in this room is well aware that here in the U.S., we're going through our own challenges with protecting U.S. electoral systems, including dealing with external interference to voter suppression. It is vitally important that countries not leave their political systems vulnerable. A key part of ensuring the credibility of Zimbabwe's elections is to ensure that the Electoral Commission is independent, impartial, and nonpartisan. It is also essential that every citizen has the right to voice their views and opinions individually and collectively, that they have the ability to vote, that elections are free from violence, that opposition parties are able to operate and campaign freely without harassment, that the election is transparent, that the institutions can operate independently, and that the military does not engage in politics. The current administration has an opportunity to break with the past, to set the country on a new course by strengthening democratic institutions and rule of law, improving human rights and civil liberties, including allowing freedom of assembly and expression, and enacting economic and political reforms that will better the lives of Zimbabwean citizens. But they also have an opportunity to address many of the challenges that were not resolved during Mugabe's presidency so that the country can truly enter a post-Mugabe era.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Bass. I'd like to now welcome our very, very distinguished panel, and beginning with Ambassador Charles Ray, who served as U.S. Ambassador to Zimbabwe as well as Cambodia. Ambassador Ray retired in 2012, although you can't call what he's doing now retirement. He's more active than ever. After a 30-year career in the U.S. Foreign Service that included postings in China, Thailand, Sierra Leone, and Vietnam. He also served as the first U.S. Consul General in Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam. Prior to joining the Foreign Service, Ambassador Ray spent 20 years in the U.S. Army, retiring with the rank of Major during his Army career. He did 2 tours in Vietnam, served in military intelligence, special operations, and public affairs, with assignments in Germany, Korea, Vietnam, Panama, and the United States. Since his retirement, he has been a writer, lecturer, and consultant, and has done research on leadership and ethics. He is the author of more than 60 books of fiction and nonfiction. Ambassador Ray is a member of the American Foreign Service Association, is on the board of directors of the American Academy of Diplomacy and the Cold War Museum at Van Hill, Virginia, and is director of communications for the Association of Black American Ambassadors. We welcome your testimony, Mr. Ambassador, and thank you for your service to our country, both in uniform and in the Foreign Service. We'll then hear from Elizabeth Lewis, who is a Regional Deputy Director for Africa at the International Republican Institute, or IRI, where she oversees field offices in 12 nations, including Zimbabwe. In her role at IRI, she focuses on the implementation of local governance, elections, conflict mitigation, and civil society programs. Since 2009, Ms. Lewis has managed IRI programs in sub-Saharan Africa, specializing in the Horn and Southern African regions. She observed Tunisia's December 2014 presidential runoff election, Nigeria's March 2015 general election, and Ghana's December 2016 national elections. Ms. Lewis has a BA in Political Science and Economics from St. Mary's College in Maryland, and an MS in Political Economy of Late Development from the London School of Economics and Political Science. Thank you for being here as well. We'll then hear from Ben Freeth. MBE is an Executive Director of the Mike Campbell Foundation, an organization fighting for human rights and property rights in Zimbabwe. Together with his late father-in-law, Mike Campbell, the owner of Mount Carmel Farm in central Zimbabwe, Mr. Freeth took President Robert Mugabe's government to court in the Southern African Development Community's regional court, the SADC Tribunal, contesting the regime's ongoing attempts to unlawfully seize Mr. Campbell's farm and for engaging in racial discrimination and violence against white commercial farmers and their workers. Mr. Campbell, his wife, and Mr. Freeth were abducted and tortured in 2008 and later suffered the destruction of their home by fire. Since 2011, Mr. Freeth has been involved in initiatives to restore the SADC Tribunal after it was shut down by the SADC head of state, thus denying individual citizens access to the Human Rights Court. Mr. Freeth also works closely with Foundations for Farming, an organization that provides training in conservation agricultural and teaches impoverished farm workers and others how to feed their families. We welcome back Mr. Freeth, who testified before this subcommittee in 2015. Then we'll hear from Dr. Chipo Denderea, who is a Zimbabwean political scientist currently serving on as a consortium for faculty diversity fellow and visiting assistant professor of political science at Amherst College. Dr. Denderea's research expertise is in democracy, elections, and migration, with a regional interest in African politics. He writes about the impact of voter exit, migration, and remittances on the survival of authoritarian regimes. Her new research is on the role of technology and social media in new democracies. We welcome her testimony before the subcommittee and thank her for being here as well. Mr. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Bass, I'm very honored to be able to appear here today to discuss the path forward in U.S.-Zimbabwe relations. I served as U.S. Ambassador to Zimbabwe from 2009 to 2012 during the period of the ZANU-PF-MDC coalition government, a time of relative peace and a certain amount of economic stability, but unfortunately also a time of lost opportunities to put Zimbabwe on the path of a truly representative government and a prosperous economy. Most Americans probably know very little about Zimbabwe, but for a brief time this past November, it was again very prominent in the American media. After several weeks of increasing political turmoil, primarily within Mugabe's ruling party, the first Vice President, Emmerson Mnangagwa, was accused of disloyalty and sacked. He then fled to South Africa, claiming that his life was in danger. Around the same time, Mugabe's wife, Grace, began to appear more and more in public, stating that she should be the one to succeed the aging leader, statements that Mugabe, to his discredit, did nothing to deny. An unprecedented for Zimbabwe move, General Constantine Chiwenga, Chief of the Defense Staff, made a public statement that the military would not stand idly by and allow liberation figures to be removed from the government or from the party. He was accused of treason, but shortly thereafter the military made its move. It took control of key installations in Harare, placed Mugabe and his family under effective house arrest, although it was very quick to publicly state this is not a coup. But as one opposition figure said, if it looks like a duck and it walks like a duck, it's a duck. Make no mistake about it, even though it was a palace coup with the military moving against members of its own party or the party that it supports, it was, in fact, a coup d'etat. A relatively nonviolent one and done in a most unusual way. Mugabe was allowed to meet with the press, to engage in a phone conversation with the former president of South Africa, and his meeting with the leader of the coup, with General Chiwenga, at least on the surface, appeared to be very cordial, and he was even allowed to call a cabinet meeting. But it was still a change of government initiated by force of arms rather than through the ballot box. However, how the military's actions in this case will be dealt with, I think, is something for Zimbabweans to handle. For the rest of the world, and for the U.S. in particular, I think the key questions now are, where is Zimbabwe going from here, and what role should we play in that journey? We should start, I think, with a bit of background on the new interim president, Emmerson Mnangagwa. I think the question on many minds is, will he be any different from Mugabe? He is, after all, someone who worked closely with Mugabe for more than 37 years after the country's independence and served as an intelligence officer during the War for Independence, and who, because of his actions in support of the crackdown on the Ndebele political opposition in the 1980s and MDC supporters in the 1990s, has earned the nickname the Crocodile. Prior to being appointed to the first vice president position, Mnangagwa served as defense minister and also as justice minister. Though he lacks Mugabe's charisma, it appears that he enjoys the firm support of many of the senior military officials. I think moving forward, his first priority will be to reassert control over ZANU-PF, a party that is fractured along generational lines, with many of those in their 40s and 50s, known as the G40, supporting Grace Mugabe against the older Liberation-era party members. A united ZANU-PF is essential if the party is to retain power. This won't be an easy task for Mnangagwa, as the rift between the two demographics was worsened by some of the actions and rhetoric during September and November of last year. The issue is further complicated by the presence of former ZANU-PF No. 2, Joyce Mujuru. She was first vice president until she was canned a few years ago. She is now the head of the People First, or ZIM-PF party. Until Grace Mugabe engineered her ouster, she was in competition with Mnangagwa to be Mugabe's successor. A veteran of the liberation struggle, as a fighter with a fierce reputation, she also enjoys some military support, although probably not as much as Mnangagwa. His second priority, I believe, will be to ensure ZANU-PF's continued control of power in the country. If he can somehow pull all of the factions together and overcome the possible threat from Majuro, he will have to decide whether or not to proceed with elections in July 2018. I realize that he has publicly stated that he will, but we will have to see what really happens. While violence and chicanery are still possibilities that cannot be cavalierly dismissed, a united ZANU-PF is likely to be able to do well against the current opposition party lineup. The Movement for Democratic Change, or MDC, is still split between the faction led by the late Morgan Tsvangirai, now with an interim president, Nelson Chamisa, and the one led by Welcome Nube. As the parties that pose the greatest challenge to ZANU-PF, especially in the urban areas, if they were united, they would surely do well, but it's unlikely that they will unite. The remainder of the opposition parties, with the exception of Joyce Mujuru's party, will only take votes away from the two MDCs, which is to ZANU-PF's advantage, unfortunately. In the rural areas, ZANU-PF has, in the past at least, had an advantage, and Mnangagwa is sure to capitalize on this. So while it's too early to predict that the 2018 elections will be free, fair, and nonviolent, let's assume for a moment that they will be. Where do we go from that point? During my time as ambassador to Zimbabwe, one of the most frequent topics of conversation was U.S. sanctions. Put in place in response to the violent land seizures and electoral violence of the late 1990s, the Zimbabwe Democracy and Economic Recovery Act, or ZEDERA, was passed in December 2001, and a presidential executive order targeting individuals and entities involved in the violence and other anti-democratic acts was issued in March 2003. Both of these actions were intended to encourage a return to democracy and representative government, something that had not happened by the time of my arrival in 2009. After the MDC won the 2008 elections, although without the necessary 51% majority, there was more violence. But under South African pressure, a coalition government was formed. That government, with the MDC in a decidedly subordinate position to ZANU-PF, lasted until the 2014 elections, in which ZANU-PF got the required majority and subsequently formed a government without the MDC. The sanctions, in my view, were clearly not having the desired effect, and Mugabe's party's hardliners were using their existence as an excuse for every ill that the country suffered. My response to the many questions of when will the sanctions be lifted was when there is a return to nonviolent elections and democracy. In fact, during one of my final media interviews before I departed in 2012, I said that sanctions were a response to a violent electoral process. A credible electoral process free of violence would make our current policy somewhat irrelevant. If this year's elections are held, if they're determined to be credible, and if there is no violence, the ball will be in our court. If we truly want to see Zimbabwe develop to its potential, we must be prepared to work with the winner of a credible, nonviolent election, regardless of the political party. Even if the election is credible and nonviolent, any new government is almost certain to contain officials who bring a lot of historical baggage with them to their positions. I firmly believe, however, that we should, in such a situation, put the past behind us and focus on the policy statement and the introduction of ZEDERA. It is the policy of the United States to support the people of Zimbabwe in their struggle to effect peaceful, democratic change, achieve broad-based and equitable economic growth, and restore the rule of law. I leave development of the precise modalities of our actions to the policymakers and the professionals in the foreign and civil services of our foreign affairs agencies, primarily state and aid, but I would offer a few humble suggestions on a way forward. First, I think we should instruct our embassy in Harare to make contact with Mnangagwa and his current government to reiterate firmly our policy regarding sanctions and to inform him if upcoming elections are credible and nonviolent, we are prepared to recognize and work with the new government. While we would continue to monitor the human rights situation, our initial focus should be on actions to reinvigorate the country's economy and empower the private sector to revitalize the agricultural sector and rebuild stagnant industries with a view to creating meaningful employment and broad economic security. We should encourage the new government to develop an investor-friendly climate, take steps to curb corruption, while at the same time encourage American businesses to explore the opportunities to increase two-way trade and investment. You might note I said nothing about lifting sanctions. I think that should be the stick. The carrot, I think, would be our offer to deal with the government. The stick is, if they don't deal, sanctions stay in place. During my time as ambassador, we experimented with a local economic development program modeled on an Asian village financing scheme that I encountered when I lived in Korea back in the 1970s. Women in a few poor rural villages were taught to organize local savings clubs in which deposits were loaned out to members at low interest for income-producing ventures. These programs, though they were known to the government, were outside government control and within months of establishment, totally self-reliant. Consideration should be given to implementing such a program in rural and suburban communities throughout the country. People who are economically self-sufficient are less vulnerable to political exploitation. The elephant in the room, which can't be ignored, is the Zimbabwean military. Existing laws and regulation will limit what we can do with the military. But for the long term, peaceful development of Zimbabwe, at some point, we will have to figure out a way to work with this institution. Initially, I believe the primary focus should be on inculcating in the military establishment an ethos of service to the nation as a whole, rather than identification with a specific political party. In my limited contact with senior military officials when I was ambassador, I was convinced that there exists within the military establishment a small cadre of people who would like to be professional and who would like to depoliticize the institution. The challenge will be to identify those individuals and develop effective ways of working with them. One possibility, I think, might be to establish a working relationship with the SADC Peacekeeping Academy, which happens to be located in Harare, and allowing properly vetted Zimbabwean military officials to participate in courses of instruction on military professionalism. Again, I leave it to State and Defense, working with Congress, to determine if such a program could be implemented and just how it should. While I have, in making these recommendations, assume that elections will be held in July 2018 and assume that they will be credible and nonviolent, I must make clear at this point that I'm not making a prediction. I do believe that if everyone in Zimbabwe approaches the coming months with an earnest desire to see the country pull itself out of the doldrums and take its rightful place in the region and in the world, it can happen. If it does happen, if everyone then puts the past behind them and focuses on the future, a new and more vibrant Zimbabwe can arise phoenix-like from the ashes. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Ambassador Ray. Ms. Lewis.
Chairman Smith and Ranking Member Bass, it's an honor to testify before you today on the upcoming elections in Zimbabwe and the prospects for genuine democratic reform following the end of President Mugabe's 37-year rule. I work for the International Republican Institute, which is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that is committed to advancing freedom and democracy worldwide. Since the early 1990s, IRI has supported pro-democracy activists in their struggle to bring real and lasting democratic reform to Zimbabwe. Over the course of the last few months, Zimbabwe has turned a page in its history. On the evening of November 14th, several leaders within the Zimbabwe Defense Forces led a coup against the government of President Robert Mugabe, which ended in his resignation a few days later. Then, just 2 weeks ago today, opposition leader and former Prime Minister Morgan Tsvangirai succumbed to his battle with cancer. The departure of both Mugabe and Tsvangirai has upset the political order, and while some see the present situation as an opportunity for positive change, it's also a very fragile period for the country. ZANU-PF remains in full control of Zimbabwe's governing institutions and chose former Vice President Emmerson Mnangagwa to serve as the country's third president. Mnangagwa's reputation precedes him, leaving many, including myself, skeptical of the prospect for genuine democratic reform under his leadership. One of his first acts as president, for instance, was to appoint a 22-member cabinet that included ZANU-PF hardliners and several military leaders who led the coup to put him in power. Meanwhile, Zimbabwe's fractured political opposition is represented by several loose and evolving coalitions of political parties from both the historical opposition, including Tsvangirai's MDCT, and defectors from ZANU-PF, including Joyce Majuru. To date, the three main opposition coalitions, which include the MDC Alliance, the People's Rainbow Coalition, and CODE, have been unable to unite under a single cohesive electoral and governing coalition. According to Zimbabwe's 2013 constitution, bearing a dissolution of parliament, the 2018 elections must occur between July 23rd and August 22nd. In recent statements, though, President Mnangagwa indicated the elections would occur before July and that they would be free, fair, credible, and free of violence. However, in observing the biometric voter registration process that began on September 14th, the Zimbabwe Election Support Network, or ZESN, indicated that turnout for the registration process was low, particularly among young people. The group cited limited voter education, intimidation of registrants, and misrepresentation of ID requirements as contributing factors to low turnout. The challenge of high rates of voter illiteracy must be addressed through extensive voter education efforts in the lead up to Election Day. However, the short and still unannounced electoral timeline, combined with the challenges of misinformation, fears of violence, and the historical legacy of election fraud, makes all of this a significant undertaking. Additionally, the environment in which campaigns and elections occur must be conducive to genuine political competition. For this to happen, several laws in Zimbabwe used to limit freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and freedom of the press, and also restrict access to information must be repealed or reformed to align with the 2013 Constitution. Finally, the importance of a viable opposition capable of competing in the electoral process cannot be understated. A critical benchmark for the opposition in the coming elections is the prevention of a supermajority in the National Assembly to prevent, among other things, amendment to the Constitution that would restrict political space and fundamental freedoms or grant additional powers to the presidency. It is vital that the U.S. stand by the Zimbabwean people in the movement for democratic reform in this period of transition. And with that goal in mind, I'd like to offer the following recommendations. First, the United States must be ardent in its support for free and fair elections. The citizen movements of last year are evidence of the strong desire for genuine change. The current government lacks electoral legitimacy and has a stated interest in returning to a full constitutional order. Considering this alignment of interests, the U.S. must redouble its efforts to work with our Zimbabwean and regional partners, namely SADC and the African Union, to stand for nothing less than a transition to democratic rule. Relatedly, and over the longer term, the U.S. and our democratic allies must provide support to foster a competitive multi-party political system and the establishment of democratic institutions in Zimbabwe. This would include judicial, criminal justice, and security reform, opening the information space, the full implementation of the 2013 Constitution, responsive and participatory governance and service delivery, and a legitimate truth and reconciliation process. Third, the United States should be prepared for numerous scenarios in a post-Mugabe era. ZANU-PF and the military complex that plays an increasingly visible role in the political party has everything to lose from a shift in the power dynamics of the country. Political repression and disregard for fundamental human and political rights is an ongoing problem in Zimbabwe, and we need to be vigilant under the new dispensation in the lead up to and following elections. And finally, the United States must hold the line with targeted sanctions and within international financial institutions. This is our strongest point of leverage in the push for democratic reform and respect for fundamental human rights and freedoms. Reforms must be required as a precondition for lending and debt or sanctions relief. I thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Ms. Lewis, thank you very much for your recommendations and your testimony and your work. Thank you. Mr. Freeth.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor to be here once again in Washington, D.C., and to be able to testify straight out of Zimbabwe as to where we are at this point. And it's really heartening to hear so much talk about the rule of law and the importance of the rule of law in our country. And I think when we look back and we see what has taken place with 25% of the population having left our country, with the education systems, which were the best in Africa, being trashed, with the social systems ending up in total state of disrepair, with the economy in total tatters, with people queuing outside the banks just to try and withdraw their money. We have to look at the cause of these things. And the cause is the destruction of the rule of law and the destruction of property rights. And so we've just had a coup. We're 100 days in or thereabouts, not quite. And where are we now? Are things getting better? Are reforms taking place? And I think if we listen to the rhetoric, it sounds all very good. There is a massive charm offensive taking place at the moment, and many people are taken in by that charm offensive of the president and others in trying to make it look as though things have changed because the guy at the top has changed. But when you look at it on the ground, unfortunately, not a lot has yet changed. There's talk about 99-year leases on land, but when you look at the small print, those 99-year leases are actually only 90-day leases, in that there's a clause that allows government to cancel those leases on notice in 90 days' time. We are seeing talk about the rule of law coming back, property rights coming back, but at this stage, we have seen no laws actually changed. Even the Indigenization Act has not been repealed. We see the militarization of many parts of government. We've obviously got the former Minister of State Security as the president. We've got the former Minister of Defense and after that of the Armed Forces as the vice president. We've got the guy who was in charge of 5th Brigade that massacred 20,000 people in Matabeleland as the Minister of Lands. And then within the civil service, there are many military figures actually coming in. So we've got, and within the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission as well. So we've got a situation where there's a huge amount of charm, but we've still got the same situation on the ground. So I think we have to look at that, and we have to look at what needs to be done in order to restore rule of law and to restore property rights. And I think Zadera was a very far-thinking program or act that was put in place in December 2001. And I would like to recommend very strongly that Zadera does remain in place. One of the aspects of Zadera was respect for ownership and title to property. One of the main issues relating to the destruction of the economy. And I believe that the judgment that came in from the SADC tribunal, an African solution to an African problem, this tribunal that gave a judgment in favor of property rights back in 2008, should actually be incorporated within Zadera. so that it becomes the international legal obligations as per the SADC Treaty should be brought in as part of ZEDERA. I think also we've talked a lot about free and fair elections. It's absolutely imperative that there are people on the ground observing now as to what is taking place in terms of the militarization of ZEC, the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission, and of the intimidation that is going on in the rural areas ahead of the election. And I think the third thing that is so important is that the SADC Tribunal, this court that was set up for the 280 million people in southern Africa, is brought back into being. And at this stage, we've done an awful lot. We're actually expecting a judgment tomorrow in South Africa regarding our case against President Zuma for his part in destroying that SADC Tribunal. And we expect a good judgment. But we need to have other governments being brought to task within the SADC region or other heads of state for their part in signing a new protocol that takes away the right of the individual to be able to go to that court as a court of last resort. We hope for a better country, and I think a major step has been taken with President Mugabe not being in place any longer at the head. But we need the next step to be taken, where the rule of law is brought back, where democracy is able to take place, and where human rights are respected along with property rights. I thank you.
Thank you so very much, Mr. Freeth. We now go to our fourth and final panelist, Dr. Dendera. Thank you again for being here.
Thank you, Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Karen Bass, for the invitation to testify today. The United States and Zimbabwe have had a long and supportive relationship. The United States remains Zimbabwe's biggest donor and has already given $1 billion in aid since 2001. The out of Mr. Mugabe in November 27, after a military-led guardian coup that ended in his resignation, is an outcome that many of us would not have predicted. I believe I also speak for my generation, those of us born after independence, when I say the idea of a post-Mugabe Zimbabwe is quite surreal. Mr. Mugabe's 37-year tenure was complex. While he made significant improvements in welfare provision, his authoritarian rule resulted in much suffering, notably the 1983 Matabeleland genocide and violence against political opponents. In response to the declining economy, at least 2 million Zimbabweans emigrated. At least 80,000 of those found refuge in the United States. Zimbabweans in the United States are highly skilled, and many of them have been educated at top universities, including MIT, Harvard, and Yale. Zimbabwean Americans have also made significant contributions in the arts, for example, the brilliant Black Panther actress Danai Gurira. While Zimbabweans celebrated the change in the government, this quickly turned into alarm when the continued involvement of the military in otherwise civilian affairs. When I flew into the Harare International Airport in early December, soldiers required everyone arriving to show our IDs. This was new for Zimbabwe. It is unlikely that an unreformed ZANU-PF government will usher in a democratic system. It is also unlikely, following the death of Morgan Tsvangirai, that a divided opposition climate will spur democratic growth. It is my expert opinion that additional government-to-government aid and investment will not solve Zimbabwe's problems in the absence of significant reforms that address elections, corruption, and economic development. While President Mnangagwa has stated his commitment to free and fair elections, state media is heavily controlled by the ruling party. Democracy cannot thrive when the media is stifled. State institutions such as the police and the military remain partisan. The peacefulness of the 2018 election is that at risk. Zimbabwe's high youth unemployment has also created a readily available marketplace of youth who can be paid to harm others. Inter-party violence is also a growing concern. However, despite these restricted access to state media, initiatives such as the Open Pali platform and Bus Stop TV, a political satire group, have effectively utilized social media and have a combined reach of over 500,000 citizens. Voice of America remains an important media platform, reaching nearly 700,000 citizens weekly. I recommend that the United States continue providing funding for VOA and independent media. Zimbabwe loses between $1 to $2 billion from corruption each year. President Mnangagwa has promised zero tolerance on corruption. However, to date, corruption investigations have targeted only those affiliated with the losing pro-Mugabe faction of ZANU-PF. At least 5 members of President Mnangagwa's cabinet have been implicated in corruption worth billions of dollars. Although President Mnangagwa recently announced that some officials have heeded his call to return stolen funds and to declare assets, no specifics have been shared about those returns. Corruption is an epidemic. For this reason, it is important for the United States to engage the new government very strongly and firmly on corruption. ZANU-PF often blamed Zimbabwe's stunted economic growth on economic sanctions, in particular, United States Zimbabwe Democracy and Economic Recovery Act, ZIDERA. Lack of clarity on both the Zimbabwe and US investor side on the requirements of ZIDERA have had some negative implications on investment. For example, Zimbabwean businesses have been denied credit by American banks who are not clear on the policy requirements under ZIDERA. Clarity on the types of business-to-business engagements acceptable within the confines of ZIDERA is required. I also recommend that the United States reconsider sanctions on state-owned businesses. Justifiably, the United States has long been concerned with the link between ZANU-PF and state enterprises. Indeed, much of the corruption has occurred in the state-owned businesses. However, it is my expert opinion that in the post-Mugabe era, legislative independence has been bolstered and the parliament is now equipped to hold government officials to account. Regarding individual sanctions, the onus is on those listed to prove their commitment to democracy. Many on the list have allegedly committed horrible crimes against humanity. It would be a greater injustice to lift these sanctions before a thorough investigation has been conducted. Zimbabwe cannot have economic growth that is divorced from addressing human rights abuses. Robert Mugabe's exit from politics is not enough to absolve individual crimes. President Mnangagwa's motto is that Zimbabwe is open for business. Zimbabwe has long been open for business, but poor governance bottlenecked efforts by local and foreign investors. President Mnangagwa has said all the right things necessary for conducive business environment in Zimbabwe. The real test will be whether he follows through on his promises. His government has thus far made adjustments to unpopular policies, including the Indigenization Empowerment Act, which should help increase investor confidence. While the United States faces tough competition from China and Russia in sourcing Zimbabwe's natural resources, Zimbabweans that I've spoken to have indicated a preference for American business. A democratic Zimbabwe and strengthened US-Zimbabwe economic partnership remains mutually beneficial for the two countries. Thank you.
Thank you. I thought you might have one final statement to make. I appreciate it. Let me begin the questioning. First, maybe Ambassador Ray, if I go to you, but others who would like to answer these questions, please. We know that Mnangagwa was obviously head of state security and the CIO during some very, very brutal periods, hence the name Crocodile, perhaps, but also people who suggest that maybe he's a changed man today. I wonder, however, if we could, it's important to know past sometimes is prologue, far too often it's prologue. How many political prisoners, years to date, have there been in Zimbabwe? And if you could expound upon the use of torture, I have authored 4 laws on torture victims. It's called the Torture Victims Relief Act. And here in this room, I have heard testimony, as has my staff, as well as in countries all over the world, at torture centers as well as in prisons. The Laogai in Jakarta, Soviet Union, the use of torture is also often endemic. And I'm wondering, you know, I know Mr. Freeth, and without objection, your full statement, like all of your full statements, will be made a part of the record. You have, you know, a picture of both you and Mike Campbell, your father-in-law, who was killed by way of a beating, and you with blood all over your face. And you point out, you know, obviously there will be another question about the SADC courts, and Ambassador Imari will speak to that as well, which were done away with in 2012. Is that something that would come back? Is that something that the Trump administration and the European community, and especially the African countries, need to say, that needs to be returned? Legacy human rights issues are as important as current-day human rights issues. There is no statute of limitations on torture and other kinds of horrific misdeeds or murder. So if you could speak to that, if you would, as an opening. And then I have some additional questions about, you know, the Dr. Frist-Feingold legislation, which we've already heard a lot of talk about, Zadira. You know, that had to do, obviously, with loans, no more debt relief, and you might recall debt relief during those years was one of the most popular issues around. Bono certainly helped to make it very popular, but debt relief is off the table when you're dealing with an abusing country. You know, I think, Mr. Freeth, you at least alluded to, or maybe even said how important it was that SADC restoration, especially judgments, ought to be part of lifting of sanctions, and maybe you might want to speak to that as well.
All right, thank you, sir. As to the number of prisoners, I'm afraid I don't know either currently or historically. I don't know currently, and historically, if I was told, I've reached an age where my brain cells don't retain such things. On the issue of the SADC tribunal, I would strongly suggest that we reach out to whoever we can to encourage the return of that. One of the issues in lectures I've given on Zimbabwe over the last 6 years, one of the points I make repeatedly is that a lot of the issues in Zimbabwe arise from historical incidents that have never been resolved. Going back, of course, to Gukurahundi in the 80s when some 20,000 Ndebele were killed over a 2-year period, and I think it was by the 5th Brigade, which was trained by the North Koreans. But it goes even beyond that, and a lot of these issues have just been brushed under the rug. People don't like to talk about it. One of the things I learned from my time in Cambodia in dealing with the Khmer Rouge Tribunal is that if nothing else, creating a venue where these issues can be brought to light and discussed, whether they result in judicial punishment or not, is actually less important than having them officially and formally acknowledged. So I would definitely argue that the SADC tribunal or some similar institution should be put in place, and it should be a permanent institution to deal with these issues, not just in Zimbabwe, but across the region as a whole. South Africa itself has issues that are still unresolved that need to be taken care of. In terms of the issue of sanctions, you have Zadira on the one hand, which addresses the country's debt and its international loans, and if I'm not mistaken, actually Zimbabwe is not even eligible to apply for loans currently because of its arrears to the international financial institutions, and so leaving Zadira in place, it's a handy tool to have for later, but it has no impact now. The other issue, people often get confused between Zadira and the administrative sanctions, which came in 2 years later. And these, I think, are the real immediate stick that we can use. But but people have to understand that these sanctions are not against the country in its entirety, but against specific individuals and specific entities. I think a lot of people here in the U.S. misunderstand that. And it does not limit or prohibit commercial transactions. And I'm still a firm believer in revitalizing and in strengthening the private sector as a counterweight against an out-of-control government. One of the ways that ZANU-PF and the military and security services manage to maintain such control is people have no place else to turn. If you had a stronger private sector, as we've seen in places like Korea — I was in Korea in the 1970s when it was still a dictatorship — watching the development of a vibrant middle class and of an economy that was growing and creating jobs has created a completely different Korea. It went from a military dictatorship, still evolving, but it's now, I think, the 13th largest economy in the world and growing. This, I believe, can be done in places like Africa as well. Zimbabwe has the infrastructure. It has an educated population, has an energetic population when given the opportunity to act. And if the private sector were invigorated and strengthened, I think you could see eventually, incrementally, over time, changes in the right direction in the country.
Do we know where Mnangagwa stands on the SADC issue?
Mr. Chairman, I don't think anyone but Mnangagwa knows where he stands on any issue.
But it's something, do you think we should press with him?
I think we should press with him the return of the SADC tribunal. As I said in my statement, we should reach out now to this government and lay out our wishes, if you will, or our vision for where things should go, and that, I think, should be one of the things on the list of to-do items.
Okay, I appreciate that. Would anybody else on the panel want to address any of those questions? Yes.
Just briefly on the United Nations Convention Against Torture. Zimbabwe is one of the very, very few countries around the world that has not signed that United Nations Convention Against Torture. It's one of the few blank spots on the world map. And so torture is able to take place in Zimbabwe without that UN convention coming into being. So that is something that we need to look at.
Yes.
I was going to add that while the numbers of the people that have been arrested for political engagement are unclear, in the new dispensation, as it has been called, there remain quite a few people who are in prison for politically related protests, and the numbers are quite alarming when you look at women. But beyond that, there have been individuals who've been disappeared during the Mugabe regime, and those individuals, we've not had any feedback from the government on whether there have been inquiries for, in particular, Itai Dzamara, who disappeared a few years ago. President Mnangagwa at the time was the Minister of Justice and promised that there was going to be an inquiry and a hearing on where this man went, because his family has not been able to grieve for him or to bury him. And so such incidents, it's really important for the government to address that. And if Itai Dzamara is alive, that he should be released. And if, God forbid, he has passed on, then his family deserves to know that as well.
Last week, I chaired a hearing with Marco Rubio on Tibet. We co-chair the China Commission. And from a trip there, many trips there in the past, from work on China since I got elected to Congress in 1981, China is in a terrible, terrible race to the bottom with North Korea on human rights abuses. Xi Jinping is, has crushed religion, crushed NGOs that don't really exist, but any semblance of an NGO, and the consolidation of power harkens back to the Cultural Revolution. We know that General Chiwenga was in Beijing immediately prior. The entire unfolding of the Mugabe situation. I'm wondering if any of you have any insights as to where China was or might have been in orchestrating or giving a wink or a push for his ouster? And in terms of good or bad governance, what is China's influence? We've had hearings on this subcommittee about China's bad governance rule of law model that it promotes. You know, it's certainly not democracy. It's absolutely not human rights oriented. So if perhaps, Ambassador, I think you're getting ready to respond.
Well, my experience with China, 4 years serving in China and 3 years of dealing with my Chinese counterpart in Zimbabwe. First and foremost, what the Chinese look for in countries like Zimbabwe is their version of stability, because they're basically there to get access to resources. I would, and this is a wild guess, say that I don't think that necessarily it's Chinese engineered or ordered or orchestrated the change in government, but I would be quite surprised to find out that that was not part of the discussions that Chiwenga had with his counterparts when he was in China, and that the Chinese answer was probably keep it simple, get it done.
Okay. Yes. Ms. Lewis.
I think I would agree with Ambassador Ray that while it may not have been kind of overt push for the coup, that I'm sure there was a seeking of approval or assertions that they wouldn't resist kind of the outcome. I think more broadly, I mean, in looking at Chinese development model, it's much more exploitative, looking for resources, but also labor or employment for Chinese workers. Chinese investment tends to not benefit the African economies. And so we should also be very aware and kind of monitoring the Chinese actions. Of course, we know that the Chinese have been supporting the Mugabe regime for many years, hosting his birthday parties very lavishly, recipients of elephants being exported, things of that nature. And so it's certainly not a productive relationship in the way that we would like to see for democracy and human rights in Zimbabwe.
Just very briefly on the Chinese, it was quite interesting when under President Mugabe, some of their diamond claims were taken away from them in the Marangi diamond fields. And I happened to have breakfast with the European Union ambassador just after that, and I said, have you had any interaction with the Chinese ambassador regarding this situation where the diamond claims have been taken away? And he said yes, and I asked, well, what did the Chinese ambassador have to say? And he said, well, normally the Chinese ambassador is inscrutable. But he said in this case, it was very clear that he was absolutely mad about what had taken place. So whether that had contributed to Mugabe falling out of favor with the Chinese or not, we don't actually know. But they're about whatever resources they can get out of a country, and I suspect that had something to do with it.
Let me just ask, one of the Achilles heels in many elections everywhere is the Election Commission or Electoral Commission. What are the strengths or weaknesses, or is there an Achilles heel with the ZEC in Zimbabwe, as far as you know? I mean, we've raised this in hearing after hearing after hearing. If you don't get that right, if you don't have free and fair going in, people that will ensure that all the ballots are counted, that all the candidates who could be eligible and meet the, a predetermined criteria are put on the ballot without arbitrarily being excised. How would you assess the ZEC? Secondly, the faith community. We know that on human rights they had spoken out, whether it be the Catholic Church or the other Christian churches, very boldly on human rights abuses. Your thoughts on that? I know that the Catholic Church is talking about, a sense of forgiveness, because they so desperately, I think, want to see a transition to an all-inclusive Zimbabwe where everyone really feels a part of it. Your thoughts on the faith community and what role they should play. And thirdly, we did invite, again, the administration to be here. Ambassador Yamamoto would most likely be the person who would be here to testify. And And I think it is valid that they did say that with the trip coming up with Secretary Tillerson, he, had to postpone, but not, it's a matter of delay and not I won't show up. So we will have that hearing, but we're in a very tight window with the anticipation of this election coming up. I'm not sure how that gets pulled together in a credible way so fast. And are the election monitors, AU, European, American, others being invited to participate with, on-the-ground election monitoring in Zimbabwe?
This is something I can speak to very eloquently because it's my area of expertise. So the first thing is that election monitors will come on invitation. At the moment, the president has indicated that the European Union could likely monitor elections, SADC could monitor elections. But I think what's most important is what you've already pointed out to, what happens with the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission. And this is where the new dispensation could be a problem for ZANU-PF. ZANU-PF was able to kick Robert Mugabe out because they had the support of Zimbabweans. They had the support of Zimbabweans because Zimbabweans are now primed to protest. In 2016, I was at home and I attended about 5 different protests. We got tear gassed, we were water cannoned, various things happened. But in the last week, we saw ZEC announce something they've never done before. They announced that we've had at least 5.2 million people registered to vote out of the expected 7 million. I think that the numbers are a little bit lower because we don't have diaspora vote. Of those 5.2 million that have registered to vote, 60% are young people under the ages of 40. Now, it is going to be very difficult for ZEC to oversee a stolen election. And I would draw us back to the 2008 election. The 2008 election, Zimbabweans knew that Morgan Tsvangirai had won. The world knew that Morgan Tsvangirai had won because what happened is that Zimbabweans were posting the results of the election as it went on. So for me, it is not so important that we have physical monitors if the government puts pushback on that. What is really, really important is that we support the civil service, the civil organizations that are working on elections right now. The young people in particular have created over 20 organizations that are training Zimbabweans every single day on the importance of participating in elections. So the numbers that we received yesterday that say that 5.2 million people have registered to vote are incredible. Now, the question is, will the election be violence-free? We know that once there is violence, women in particular and young men will withdraw from the political process.
Just on, not so much ZEC, but on the way that the process takes place in intimidating people, particularly in the rural areas where I obviously come from. What happens is the military, certainly in the 2008 election, came around in the runoff election after Morgan Tsvangirai was persuaded to have the runoff. What happened was the military came around from ward to ward to every constituency, and at night indoctrinated people and used torture and violence against people in a very brutal way, so that and this comes from China. This is a Maoist system of intimidation. So the whole ward is brought together in one central point, and everyone then is indoctrinated through the night. Various people are then pointed out as having sympathized in some way with the opposition, and those people are then tortured publicly in front of everyone else in the early hours of the morning, sometimes very brutally, sometimes to death, in front of the whole village within the ward. And then morning comes and everything is peaceful. But what has happened also within that process is that certainly in our area what was happening was people were divided up into groups of 10, and then each group of 10 had an order to go to the polling booth. And so if you were in the third group of 10 and you were third in your group of 10, you would be the 33rd person to vote at that polling booth. That's how regimented it was in 2008. So what we need is not observers that are just going to be there. We tried desperately to get the observers to come out from Harare. They refused to come. They said it was too dangerous for them to come out and actually witness these pungwis, as they're called. We cannot have that kind of situation happening again. At the moment, what they're doing is saying, remember 2008. It's not happening yet. But we need people to be brave enough from the international community to come and witness this kind of system so that it cannot happen in 2018.
Just on the ZEC question, I mean, just looking at the historical legacy of the institution, kind of there will be considerable challenges to holding a free, fair, and credible election. But just a few points on kind of where we stand with at most 5 months to an election. The voter registration exercise is continuing to be ongoing, though the blitz of that has ended. There still remains voter roll challenges, including deduplication, auditing up the list, things that have not been completed, and the ZEC has not published an operational plan to date for the elections, which would also include things like procurement of ballot papers and other kind of very key technical elements of the electoral process. We also have the challenge of a new chair of the commission, and despite maybe some differing feelings about her personally, just kind of new leadership in any electoral commission so close to an electoral process is always a challenge. And then finally, I think just leaving African election commissions usually require significant technical resources and financial resources to hold free, fair, and credible elections. And I think last week the AU did pledge to support that, but with only 5 months left at most, I think it's a real uphill battle for the ZEC to be able to pull off a process that would meet international standards.
Ms. Bass?
The only thing that I would...
Oh. Go ahead.
Well, the only thing that I would add to that, I think having the international observers on the ground is important, but as I learned in Sierra Leone in the 1990s, the 1996 election there, the real important check on a lot of these issues is having local observers who are on the ground, who understand the culture and the language, but also that they have the freedom and ability to communicate what they see. And this is something that particularly in Zimbabwe, is important, and that is people having free access to means of communication, the ability to freely assemble and to get messages out. One of the things that we did when I was there as ambassador, we were forced to do because of the hardliners' determination that I would not meet with too many groups of young people, is we started convening electronic meetings, which they found it impossible to control or to interdict. This is an issue, I think, that needs to be looked at. Almost every Zimbabwean over the age of 16 has a smartphone with internet access and onboard camera. Mobilizing these people to observe and report, I think, would go a long way to at least discouraging some of the more egregious actions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Following up on this, I believe, Ms. Lewis, you mentioned that the civil service organizations that are in, or that might have been Dr. Dinray, but the importance of, instead of having out-of-the-country election observers, having people who are there. So my question was, is IRI on the ground now? And if so, are you doing the training with Zimbabweans? And if not, are you planning to?
In terms of observation, we've not, I don't believe any American organizations have been accredited. I know that is something that the embassy is engaging on. However, we are conducting programming focused on civic and voter education, mainly through Zimbabwean partners. And I think IRI in general would say that kind of this partnership with Zimbabweans to, local solutions to local problems is a priority. There are some really fantastic local organizations engaging in civic and voter education on the ground. I think one of the challenges they face is kind of the very dramatic shift in the political landscape that has happened, and so there are opportunities that exist that didn't exist a couple of months ago, perhaps you could say, and so being able to help them mobilize, mainly with resources, I think is something that the U.S. and other international partners and regional partners needs to look at in the months leading up to this electoral process to make sure that Zimbabweans are fully aware of their rights and choices on Election Day.
Thank you. Dr. Dendera, what more do you think is needed in terms of potential support from us?
I think strengthening the independent media, which I mentioned earlier, access to information is really critical. For example, with Voice of America, I'm often invited to be a panelist. And what I really like is that Voice of America allows Zimbabweans from very remote areas to call in. We've also seen a lot of participation through WhatsApp and other social media platforms, but then internet is very expensive. But young people have come up with very creative ways to reach wider audiences. So these are things that certainly need to be taken care of. And I think Mr. Frith is absolutely right that in rural areas where the fear of violence is very real, a lot of people still remember what happened before independence. They remember the violence of both the Smith regime and even the guerrillas that were fighting for freedom. So I think being able to work with organizations that educate people on their rights, how to report to the police when violence has occurred, and also how to hold the police accountable. So this is a really good time to work with the police because the police is kind of on the outs. Their faction lost in the ZANU-PF war, so the government will be quite eager to hold them to account.
So what do you think the prospects are for keeping the internet intact during this whole during the elections? Whether or not it would be shut down. Whether access would be shut, well, that has happened.
Yes. In 2016, Pastor Ivan Mawarire and others, going back to Chairman Smith's question on religious organizations, Pastor Ivan Mawarire and others coalesced together and called for a shutdown. We woke up in the morning, no one had any plans to leave home. I went for a run, I came back and my phone wasn't working. But this is the brilliance of having a country of young people. As I was trying to figure out how to get online, people were wondering, why aren't you online? And someone sent me a text message. I said, the internet is not working. They said, well, do you know what VPN is? And even as we think about China as a problematic partner, young people in China were actually the ones sending VPN codes to young people in Zimbabwe.
Wow,
so within an
really?
hour, we were all back online. We had figured out, I still don't know how to use the VPN, but my 16-year-old niece had put VPN on my phone. The shutdown was going on. And so, and even in my new research, I've been looking at the incidence of shutting down the internet across African countries. Ethiopia has learned how to do that.
Yeah.
But I think what also works for Zimbabwe is that the government officials really like being online. One of the first things that President Mnangagwa did when he came into office was to legitimize his Facebook page. So he had a live video. He had a live video on Twitter. So the way internet works is that they cannot shut it down for the rest of the country and keep it for themselves. So we just hope that their passion for being online will outweigh their need to restrict access for the rest of the country.
That's very hopeful. That's a very hopeful sign. Mr. Frith, did you have something you wanted to add to that?
Not really. I think the big difference between 2008 elections and 2018 is this very thing that everyone now has got a cell phone. Yes, in 2016 we all had that same experience, and it was incredible how people got around it, and how suddenly we were all able to be online when they had tried to switch us all off. People make a plan. We're a country of people that make a plan.
Well, you mentioned in your opening comments something about a decision that was going to be signed tomorrow, and I didn't know what you were referring to.
That's a decision in South Africa, in the High Court of South Africa, from the Judge President and 2 other judges, who we took a case against President Zuma along with the Law Society and various other legal groups, which aims to show that President Zuma's actions in signing away or signing the new protocol to the SADC tribunal, which takes away the individual's rights to go to the SADC tribunal and makes the SADC tribunal into an interstate court. So if Zambia and Zimbabwe had a dispute over an island in the Zambezi, for example, it could possibly be used for an interstate dispute. But that wasn't what the original protocol was all about. It wasn't what the SADC treaty was all about. It's not what SADC, which is there to promote human rights, rule of law, and democracy, is all about. And so when President Zuma signed that bit of paper, he did it without cabinet's approval, without Parliament even looking at it, without a consultation of the people of South Africa. So we took a case against President Zuma to say that he had acted unconstitutionally, that he had acted against the SADC treaty, that he had acted irrationally, in fact. And we're going to get that judgment tomorrow, and we're very hopeful that it will be a good judgment, and it will set the tone for other SADC countries to then say, you're right, South Africa. Our president also did the same thing, and it was irrational and unconstitutional against the SADC treaty.
Thank you. Ambassador Ray, thinking about moving forward and U.S. policy, you made a few comments about the carrot and stick. You talked about actions that I believe we could take to invigorate the economy, and you also specifically said you didn't see lifting sanctions. So I wanted to just ask you about that. I mean, you said, the possibility if things got better, but for example, we have travel sanctions against Mnangagwa. So what if the election is determined to be fair and free? Should that be lifted? And then how do we move our policy forward to help reinvigorate the economy if we also have the economic sanctions? You talked about the Korean example, and if we promoted something like that in Zimbabwe, then how would it be overseen? So I kind of wanted you to talk about more specifically how we would move forward in changing our policy as things develop, hopefully in a positive direction in Zimbabwe.
Well, I'll take the issue of sanctions first. The administrative sanctions against certain individuals, and Mnangagwa is on that list of individuals, seizes their assets here in the U.S., bank accounts and property, and limits their travel to the U.S. other than for UN events. I think... What
about coming here to meet with the State Department?
I'm sorry?
What about the UN events is one thing, but what if he were to come here?
The way it worked when I was there, if a Zimbabwean official was in the UN, in New York at the UN, and wanted to meet with someone in the State Department here in Washington, they could apply for special permission to do that. I mean, it's a convoluted process, but there are ways to work it. While I am against a wholesale lifting of all of the sanctions, one of the things I argued vehemently for when I was ambassador is a more flexible administrative sanctions regime, and I think that's what we should look at in case the election is free and fair and we have a President Mnangagwa in July or August 2018, to allow an easier process to enable us to engage him to the degree we should, to try be able to push him in the direction we want him to go. And so there is nothing in the administrative sanctions that says we cannot say, for example, say to a person, you're the president of the country, you can travel to Washington, you can travel to New York. And I think that's probably one way that we can shall we say, tighten the screw. I once said to someone when I was asked if I was averse to twisting arms, I said no, but I have to be able to take the hand first before I can twist the arm. And so I think we need to look at that. And other sanctions, when I talk about reinvigorating or invigorating, if you will, the private sector, actually the sanctions regime, except for the fact that a couple of Zimbabwe's banks are on the list, shouldn't have an impact on that. There is a certain amount of two-way trade currently existing between our countries, and there are, I think FedEx or one of the big packaging companies has a presence there, Ford has a presence there, Cargill is there, Coca-Cola is there, and several other American companies have presence in Zimbabwe, have investments in Zimbabwe. They are not that huge, but I think that if we looked at ways to strengthen the private sector contacts between non-sanctioned economic entities in Zimbabwe and commercial entities here, you create a stronger middle class, which is a little harder to intimidate and to coerce.
Thank you very much. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Just add one thing. Just in terms of the sanctions and looking at perhaps some relief in that area. I mean, it's important that these elections be considered free, fair, and credible, but that is not kind of the end point of what our conditions should be. Elections are just one point in the democratic process and the reform process, and there are many, many other areas of governance and policy in Zimbabwe that need to be looked at. To help ensure us that we're on the right path moving forward. And, really the elections we should be concerned about are the ones after the 2018 elections, when there is a more conducive political environment to free and fair competition. And so we should keep that in mind.
I agree with you in terms of these elections. As a matter of fact, in my opening comments, I stated that. Specifically, the reason why I asked is because of the president and because he's specifically named. But having said that, what is our policy moving forward? How do we, I would like to be hopeful. If it doesn't turn out in a hopeful way, then clearly we can stay with the status quo. But if it does, what is the pathway and what is the best thing for us to do?
I think that's why it's important that we engage, because in order to achieve this, everyone on the Zimbabwean side and on our side has to have a clear understanding of what it is we're asking or demanding, if you will, they do.
Exactly.
And so that's why I think our application of the sanctions to individuals needs to be flexible to enable the degree of engagement that can achieve that. We need to sit down with them. Well, we need to sit down with ourselves first and decide just what it is we want them to do,
right,
so that we don't ask them for more than they're capable of giving, but that we don't fall into the trap of accepting from them less than they're capable of giving.
Right. Thank you. Thank you very much.
And on that last point, Mr. Ambassador, that's exactly why we're having this hearing. We wanted to hear from 4 experts, people who have lived it and are knowledgeable, so that we could hopefully craft a good response, and our next hearing will be with the administration. Before you go, I do have just 2 final questions. Thank you, Karen. If the other 3 panelists, if you would like to speak to the issue of the faith-based community, the clergy, what role they're playing. In DR Congo, and I've been there, matter of fact, Greg Simpkins, who's now at USAID now, Greg, we miss you. We've been to the DR Congo together, and I can tell you that the church plays a major role in elections, not just things of the spirit, humanitarian efforts, human rights advocacy, which they do so superbly well, but also they do great work in the election area. Is that something that they're being brought into in Zimbabwe? And secondly, Zimbabwe gets a not free designation from Freedom House when it comes to press freedoms. Have you seen any amelioration of that stranglehold that Mugabe had on the media of all kinds? Is there maybe an opening, a little more independence, the ability of an editor to write an editorial that is more critical without fear? Because that would be certainly a very positive trend line. Anybody want to?
I can't really speak too authoritatively to the circumstances after I left in 2012. 2009 to 2012, there was a little modification of the press space. There were a number of independent newspapers, not very super performers, but at least they were there. There was at least one, perhaps two radio stations that were independent, where there was an absolute government iron fist was on television, one TV network in the entire country controlled by the government. So it was a mixed bag. I mean, you had independent print journals that weren't, in my opinion, very professional. You had a state-controlled newspaper. The only thing you could trust were the sports scores. The radio, I think a lot of Zimbabweans, even in ZANU-PF, got a lot of their credible news from VOA and BBC. So there's a lot of work to be done there. And again, I think this goes to the whole issue of invigorating the private sector, because in order to be effective, the newspapers, the radio, or to set up an independent TV network, it requires money. And if you have a reasonably affluent middle class, you have a private sector that's growing, then you have the source of funds to be able to create these things. A lot of the independent newspapers, for example, were the toys of some wealthy Zimbabwean who had an axe to grind, and that's just not a recipe for a very good professional independent press.
Yes.
So on the faith-based communities, it's interesting to talk about the faith-based communities and corruption in one hand. So in my statement, I say that the single biggest problem for Zimbabwe is corruption. And how does this relate to the church? Over the last 5 years, we've seen an increase in evangelical churches that sometimes have 5,000 to 10,000 people showing up. But what we've also seen is that the church has been used as a football in some ways between the ZANU-PF factions. So in the last week, we've seen one of the most popular young prophets now being brought in on acts of corruption. Where I saw some green light was at Morgan Tsvangirai's funeral, where members of the Methodist Church spoke very openly and said things that we haven't heard from the church in a long time. They say that since 2009, they were very involved in engaging with Morgan Tsvangirai on the unity government. We also saw Father Mkonori playing an important role during the coup, non-coup situation in November. So I think when the government does not punish people for speaking up, then even the church will be strengthened. But as long as Zimbabwe doesn't address its corruption, then every sector from the church to the media to the banks is in serious trouble, because now you had churches that were being used to funnel funds outside for ZANU-PF people. And then you can't say with certainty whether this church actually represents the interests of the people or whether the church represents the interests of the individuals. So corruption is very epidemic, and it now affects every single facet of Zimbabwean life in very problematic ways. And so if we're able to address that, that could be a solution. And then on the independent media, the media is not free and fair. The Herald still controls the media. I doubt that they would publish that something that I would write, right? They wouldn't publish that regardless of how I feel about the government, and I think that's a problem. At the same time, we also have a lot of print media, but as the ambassador has said, sometimes the quality is problematic. But I do want to highlight that the U.S. Embassy in Zimbabwe is doing amazing work, working with journalists already. And as we transition to the next ambassador, I hope that those programs will continue to receive funding. Beyond the work that the United States is doing, independent journalists have also been training themselves and being very engaged. But again, everyone I've spoken to is really worried that once this phase has passed, and if the government starts to feel that they're under threat, then maybe this veneer of freedom that we're seeing might be taken away. So that, I mean, we're not sure what would happen with that.
Yes.
I think you can be sure that the state media will report us all in the Herald and other more radical newspapers like the Patriot tomorrow or in the coming days. It's a foregone conclusion. As far as faith-based communities are concerned, the Christian community in Zimbabwe is huge, and there is no politician that can draw people like the churches can draw people. And so there's been a kind of, over the years, there's been, people have lost all kind of faith, as it were, in political transition, and it's the churches that have become the area of focus for people. And so when Pastor Ivan rose up and started for the first time as a church leader, speaking out strongly, people just flocked to him. And what happened in July 2016 was one of the most phenomenal things that I've ever been a part of. In the past, the church has been very afraid. But I think that cloak of fear is being gradually thrown off. And there are church leaders that are starting to stand up for justice issues and starting to talk about justice issues for the first time. And I think this needs to be really encouraged in a major way. I think it's exciting. I think it's very important that the church is able to be the moral voice of the nation, and I think it's starting to happen.
I thank all of you for your tremendous testimony. Hopefully, we can take this and really have an impact in terms of policy, because your insights have been outstanding. I would just note parenthetically that Greg Simpkins, again, who's here, used to be our chief of staff on the subcommittee, and now Piero, who is, and our general counsel. In 2015, they were in Zimbabwe and were called American spies by the media. It reminds me when I was in China on one of my human rights trips, Wei Jingsheng, the father of the Democracy for All movement, who spent about 20 years in the Gulag, the Lao guys, they call it there, tortured horribly in China. When I met with him, when he was let out briefly before getting rearrested, they interrogated him and said I was a CIA spy. One big lie. I mean, I'm a member of Congress. They're top staffers who have a huge impact. We do have a CIA, but we're not part of it. But it's amazing how they think that somehow is a slur. It's like a boomerang. It says, what kind of media are you that you would do that? I would just want to, without objection, we have a number of testimonies for the record. This is from Craig Richardson, Dr. Richardson, and also the timeline of Mike Campbell, which has been provided, of course, in the Campbell case. Without objection, these will be made a part of the record. And if our distinguished witnesses would like to add anything to the record, please do. Just send it to us. We'll include it because we want it to be as thorough as possible. Thank you so very much. The hearing's adjourned.